On the morning of March 14, 1997, a 330,000 deadweight-ton crude carrier named the Ras Tanura Star transmitted a single automated distress signal while transiting the outbound shipping lane of the Strait of Hormuz. The signal lasted 11 seconds. When the UAE Coast Guard and a U.S. Navy destroyer reached the coordinates 47 minutes later, the vessel was listing 14 degrees to port, her engine room was taking water, and a section of hull plating below the waterline had been torn inward, not outward, in a crescent-shaped rupture that the Lloyd's Marine Surveyor would later describe, in a report that never reached the public registry, as consistent with no known mechanical, geological, or structural cause. The plating was 6 centimeters of marine-grade steel. It had been punctured from the outside by something that left scoring marks, deep, parallel, evenly spaced, embedded in the torn edges of the metal. Lodged in the innermost fold of the ruptured steel, the surveyor recovered a fragment of biological material, dense, white, triangular, and serrated along both edges. He photographed it against a measuring tape before bagging it. The fragment was 17 centimeters long. The forensic report, which would remain sealed for 7 years, identified it as a tooth, but not from any species in the FA registry, not from any specimen held by the Smithsonian's Marine Vertebrate Collection, and not from any living shark documented in the scientific literature. The official UA Maritime Authority incident report, filed 3 weeks after the event, and amended twice under circumstances that the original investigating officer has publicly disputed, attributes the damage to catastrophic structural fatigue in aging hull plating. The Ras Tanura Star was 6 years old. This is the story of what the evidence actually shows, assembled from the captain's bridge log, the suppressed Lloyd survey, recovered audio from the vessel's bridge recorder, the U.S. Navy's classified response file, and the testimony of the men who were aboard that morning. To understand what happened to the Ras Tanura Star, you have to understand the water it was sailing through. The Strait of Hormuz is the most strategically critical maritime choke point on Earth, a narrow passage between the coast of Iran to the north and the Masandam Peninsula of Oman to the south, through which, in 1997, approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply transited in a continuous procession of supertankers. At its narrowest point, the strait measures roughly 21 miles across, but the navigable shipping lanes are far tighter. 2 inbound corridors and 2 outbound corridors, each barely 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Every vessel transiting the strait follows these lanes like trucks on a highway, and in 1997, an estimated 15 to 17 fully loaded crude carriers passed through every 24 hours, their hulls drawing 20 meters or more beneath the surface. The depths across the navigable channel range from 60 to 90 meters, deep enough for supertanker drafts, shallow enough that the bottom is never far away. The water itself is unusual. The Persian Gulf is essentially a shallow evaporative basin, warm, hypersaline, and dense with nutrients that funnel through the strait's constriction into the Arabian Sea. Water temperatures in the strait routinely exceed 30 degrees Celsius in summer, and the salinity readings are among the highest of any major waterway. Marine biologists at the University of Muscat published a survey paper in 1994 describing the strait's thermal and chemical profile as more closely resembling a late Miocene ocean environment than any modern waterway, warm, mineral-rich, and hospitable to large pelagic species in ways that cooler, less saline waters are not. The paper was an academic curiosity when it was published. It would take on a significance no one anticipated. Captain Youssef al-Harthi had transited the strait over 400 times in 22 years of Gulf service. He was known among port authorities and fleet operators as a meticulous shipmaster, the kind of captain who filed the most detailed bridge logs in the fleet, who noted wind shifts in half-degree increments and logged the passage of dolphins with their estimated count and heading. According to crew members who served under him over multiple voyages, Al-Harthi was not a man given to speculation, superstition, or imprecision. This matters because what he logged in the final 8 hours of the Ras Tanura star's transit is the most detailed first-hand record of the event, and the reason his career was destroyed. The vessel departed Mina Al Ahmed Terminal in Kuwait on the morning of March 13th, fully loaded with 280,000 metric tons of Kuwaiti export blend crude, drawing 22 meters, bound for the Cape of Good Hope, routing to the Atlantic Basin. The bridge log records a routine departure. Calm seas, visibility 12 nautical miles, wind from the northwest at 6 knots, all systems nominal. Al-Harthi's log entries for the first 14 hours of the transit are unremarkable. Position fixes, course corrections for traffic, notes on passing vessels. A brief entry at 14:30, documenting a pod of Indo-Pacific humpback dolphins crossing the vessel's wake. Then, at 2217 local time on March 13th, roughly 8 hours before the breach, the log entries change. The entry at 2217 reads, in Al-Harthi's precise Arabic script, sonar contact bearing 195, range 2,400 meters, depth approximately 70 meters, moving north-northwest at 14 knots. Size return consistent with large whale. Unusual. No whales expected in this traffic. Density. The vessel's navigation sonar was a Furuno CH-250, a commercial-grade hull-mounted unit designed for depth sounding and basic obstacle detection. Not a military tracking array, and not designed to classify biological contacts. But Al-Harthi had spent 2 decades reading its returns, and according to his later testimony to the Maritime Arbitration Panel, he knew immediately that the contact was wrong. It was too deep for a whale in the Strait's shipping lane, where the constant churn of propeller traffic and engine noise drive cetaceans to the surface corridors, or out of the channel entirely. It was too fast, 14 knots in a sustained straight line, not the variable speed of a feeding or transiting animal. And it was too large. The sonar return, Al-Harthi testified, indicated something between 15 and 20 meters in length, larger than any whale species commonly found in the Gulf of Oman, and moving with a directness that suggested neither feeding behavior nor migratory passage. He logged it and continued his watch. He did not yet understand what he was tracking. Over the next 3 hours, the contact did not leave. Al-Harthi's log entries document it with increasing frequency and decreasing composure. An entry every 15 to 20 minutes at first, then every 10, then every 5, each one noting the contact's bearing, range, depth, and speed with the same meticulous precision that characterized everything the captain committed to paper. What the entries reveal, read in sequence, is a pattern. The contact was not merely present, it was closing. At 2248, contact still present. Now bearing 210, range 1,800 meters, depth 65 meters. Speed increased to 18 knots. Holding parallel course. At 2,319, contact has closed to 900 meters. Depth now 55 meters. Speed 22 knots. I have never seen a whale maintain this speed. At 2,347, contact circling, bearing changing rapidly, range oscillating between 600 and 1,100 meters. It is circling the vessel. At 0024 on March 14th, contact passed directly beneath the hull. Duration of underpass approximately 9 seconds at estimated 20 knots. The helmsman felt vibration through the deck. I felt it through the wheel. The second officer, who was also on the bridge during the underpass, would later testify that the vibration was not mechanical, not the shudder of an engine misfire or the thrum of a propeller cavitation, but something deeper, something that seemed to come up through the steel of the deck itself, as though the hull had been brushed by something massive enough to displace the water beneath a 330,000-ton vessel. The chief engineer's log, maintained independently in the engine room, corroborates the 0024 event, noting unexplained low-frequency vibration. Duration 8 to 10 seconds. No corresponding change in engine parameters. Al-Harthi radioed the UAE Coast Guard at 31. The radio transcript, obtained through the arbitration proceedings, records him reporting a large unidentified marine contact maintaining close proximity to the vessel and requesting guidance. The Coast Guard operator asked if he was reporting a collision risk with a whale. Al-Harthi paused for 4 seconds before responding. He said, "I am reporting that something very large has been circling this vessel for 3 hours and has just passed beneath my keel. I do not know what it is. It is not a whale." The Coast Guard advised him to maintain course and speed and to report any contact with the hull. They did not dispatch a vessel. What happened over the next 5 hours is documented in Al-Harthi's increasingly terse log entries and in the bridge audio recorder, which captured 31 minutes of continuous audio from 0500 to 0531, the period immediately preceding and following the breach. The log entries between 0100 and 0500 describe a contact that would not leave. It circled the vessel in patterns that Al-Harthi's log describes as systematic, not the aimless wandering of a whale, but deliberate, repeated passes at varying depths and distances, as if it were studying the hull from every angle, mapping its contours, testing its responses. At 0137, the contact made a second pass beneath the keel, slower this time, the vibration lasting nearly 15 seconds, during which the helmsman reported that the compass heading fluctuated by 2 degrees, as though something had disturbed the magnetic field beneath the vessel. At 0215, Al-Harthi notes that the contact descended to approximately 85 meters, nearly the full depth of the channel, and held position directly beneath the vessel for what the log records as over 4 minutes. It was sitting on the bottom, directly below them, waiting. At 0302, the contact rose rapidly to 30 meters and accelerated to what Al-Harthi estimated as 28 knots, circling the vessel twice in under a minute before descending again, a burst of speed and energy that, in his testimony, he described as a predator testing the reaction of its prey. At 0347, Al-Harthi photographed the sonar display with a personal camera, an act that would later be cited by his employers as a breach of bridge protocol, but that would also produce one of only 2 visual records of the contact's sonar signature. At 0418, the second officer on watch reported seeing a surface disturbance approximately 200 meters off the port beam, a wake pattern with no visible source, a V-shaped displacement of the flat calm water, as if something massive had passed just below the surface, its dorsal ridge nearly breaking through. Al-Harthi photographed the sonar display a second time. Then the contact descended again. For the next 40 minutes, the sonar showed nothing. The ocean went quiet. Al-Harthi's log entry at 0500 reads simply, "Contact lost. No return on sonar." Proceeding at standard speed, the bridge audio recording begins at the same time. For the first 17 minutes, the recording captures normal bridge operations, position reports, course adjustments, low conversation in Arabic between Al-Harthi and his officers. At 0508, Al-Harthi's voice is heard directing the helmsman to watch the sonar display. A moment later, his tone changes. The acoustic analysis conducted by NAVSEA, obtained through a partial declassification in 2006, identifies a low-frequency sound beginning at timestamp 5 hours 9 minutes and 14 seconds, rising in amplitude over approximately 40 seconds. The NAVSEA report describes it as a sustained infrasonic pulse, below the range of human hearing in its lowest register, but producing an audible harmonic in the 40 to 60 Hz range that the bridge microphone captured clearly. The report notes that the acoustic signature does not match any cataloged marine species, any known vessel engine, or any geological source. It matches, however, a classified recording from 1987, a detail the NAVSEA report mentions in a single footnote, with the 1987 file number redacted. At 0514, Al-Harthy's voice is heard ordering all crew to remain inside the superstructure. His log entry at 0517, the last entry he would ever make as a ship's captain, reads, "Contact again. Not submarine. Faster than anything I have seen. It is circling." At 5 hours 19 minutes and 7 seconds, the bridge recorder captures the impact. The NAVSEA acoustic analysis describes it as a high-energy biological strike event, a single, massive percussive contact with the hull, followed by what the report terms tearing harmonics consistent with structural failure in steel plating under extreme point load stress. The acoustic profile indicates that something struck the hull below the waterline on the port side, penetrated the outer plating, and withdrew, all within an estimated 1.8 seconds. On the bridge recording, the impact is followed by the sound of the vessel groaning, a deep structural complaint that the naval architects who reviewed the audio described as the ship absorbing a force it was never designed to withstand. Then the alarms. Engine room flooding alarm. Ballast system failure alarm. The vessel began listing to port within 90 seconds. Al-Harthy's voice, steady but stripped of its earlier formality, is heard ordering the EPIRB activated and all hands to muster stations. The recording captures another sound at 5 hours 21 minutes and 33 seconds. A second, lighter contact with the hull, which the NAVSEA analysis classifies as a secondary investigative pass based on its lower energy signature and longer duration. Something returned to the breach. Something examined what it had done. Then, at 5 hours 23 minutes and 8 seconds, the bridge recorder captures the same low-frequency acoustic signature that preceded the strike, but this time moving away from the vessel, diminishing in amplitude over approximately 30 seconds before dropping below the microphone's detection threshold. The contact departed to the south-southeast, toward the Arabian Sea, toward open water. The USS Stout, an Arleigh-Burt-class guided missile destroyer operating out of Bahrain as part of the Fifth Fleet's regional presence, arrived at the Ras Tanura Star's position at 0606. The UAE Coast Guard cutter Al Dhafra arrived 12 minutes later. The scene the boarding teams encountered has been documented in photographs entered into the Lloyd's survey record and in the after-action reports, filed by both the Navy and the UAE Coast Guard. Reports that read side by side reveal a careful choreography of institutional control over the evidence. The Ras Tanura Star was listing 14 degrees to port, but had stabilized, her ballast systems fighting the flooding, her engine room partially submerged, but with watertight doors holding. No crew members were killed. 3 were treated for injuries sustained during the impact: 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a deep laceration from a navigation instrument that tore free of its mounting when the vessel lurched. The USS Stout's boarding team secured the bridge recorder and the sonar data logs within the first hour, before the UAE Coast Guard team had completed its initial walkthrough of the vessel. The Navy moved fast. They knew what to look for. It was the hull that told the story. The Lloyd's surveyor, a Scotsman named Douglas Rayburn, who had spent 31 years assessing maritime damage, claims across every ocean and every class of vessel, boarded the Ras Tanura Star the following day after it was towed to Fujairah anchorage. Rayburn was accompanied by a structural engineer from the Classification Society and a marine biologist requested by the P&I insurer, an unusual addition to a damage survey team, but the Navy boarding party had already reported biological residue at the breach site, and the insurer wanted documentation. His report, classified by Lloyd's at the request of the vessel's P&I insurer and leaked to a marine trade publication in 2004, runs to 47 pages, with 73 photographs and 6 technical diagrams. The critical findings occupy 3 paragraphs. The breach measured 2.3 meters across at its widest point and 1.1 meters in vertical extent, roughly the width and height of a standard interior door. The hull plating, 6 centimeters of H-36 high-tensile marine steel, a grade designed to withstand the compressive forces of deep-draft cargo loading and the lateral stresses of heavy weather, had been torn inward in a crescent-shaped pattern, the edges of the rupture curling into the vessel's double bottom. Void space as if peeled back by enormous force applied from a single direction. The deformation pattern, Rayburn wrote, was inconsistent with grounding, collision with submerged debris, explosive impact, or metal fatigue, and he tested for each methodically before arriving at the conclusion that the damage had no precedent in his experience. The crescent shape was the first anomaly. Metal fatigue produces linear fractures along stress lines. Grounding produces broad, irregular deformation. Explosive impact produces radial patterning outward from a blast center. This was a curved, focused rupture, as if something had closed around the hull plating and pulled. Scoring marks, deep, parallel, evenly spaced at intervals of approximately 9 centimeters, ran along the torn edges of the plating and extended for nearly a meter beyond the breach on both sides. Rayburn's report describes these marks as consistent with the application of extreme pressure through multiple fixed contact points, and notes that the spacing and depth of the scores bear no resemblance to any tool, anchor chain, or mechanical damage pattern in his 3 decades of practice. The marine biologist on the survey team swabbed the scoring marks and recovered organic residue from 12 of the 15 deepest grooves. The residue, tested at a laboratory in Dubai, was identified as fragments of dermal tissue, dense, calcite-rich, and mineralized to a degree the examining pathologist described as unlike any living marine species in the Gulf region's fauna catalog. Within the folded steel at the innermost point of the rupture, Rayburn recovered 3 fragments of biological material. The largest was the 17-centimeter tooth described at the opening of this account. The other 2 were smaller pieces of what the forensic analysis identified as dermal denticle clusters, fragments of skin or hide, dense and mineralized, with a surface texture the examining biologist described as more closely resembling calcified stone than any tissue from a living organism. The denticles were oversized, several times larger than those found on the largest great white sharks on record, and their structure, under microscopic examination, showed a ridged, layered pattern that the biologist noted was consistent with deep water adaptation over an extended evolutionary time frame. Rayburn's report includes a single sentence that has been widely quoted in the marine investigation community since the document leaked. In 31 years of practice, I have assessed damage from collision, grounding, torpedo strike, mine detonation, and structural failure in every class of vessel, from harbor tug to supertanker. I have no reference frame for what I observed on the Ras Tanura star. The tooth fragment was sent to the Smithsonian's Department of Paleobiology at the request of a marine biologist attached to the Lloyd's assessment team, a biologist who, according to colleagues interviewed years later, stared at the fragment under magnification for several minutes before setting down her instruments and asking Rayburn if he was certain it had come from the hull of a ship and not from a geological excavation. The Smithsonian's analysis, returned 8 weeks later in a report marked for restricted distribution, identified the fragment as belonging to the species Otodus Megalodon, a macropredatory shark that dominated the world's oceans during the Miocene and Pliocene epochs before disappearing from the fossil record approximately 3.6 million years ago. The specimen was, in conventional scientific understanding, a biological impossibility. The report noted that the fragment's serration pattern, mineral density, enameloid composition, and root structure were consistent with the species' extensive fossil record, but that the tissue was fresh, exhibiting none of the permineralization characteristic of fossilized specimens, retaining organic collagen in the dentin, and showing a pulp cavity consistent with active blood supply at the time of separation from the jaw. The fragment, the report stated, came from a living animal. A living animal belonging to a species that the fossil record indicated, had been extinct for longer than modern humans have existed. The Smithsonian's covering letter recommended immediate contact with NOAA's Office of Protected Resources and the Navy's Marine Mammal Program, noting that if the identification was correct, the implications for marine biology, paleontology, and maritime safety were without precedent. Neither agency has acknowledged receiving the referral. The tooth fragment's current location is unknown, transferred, according to the last available chain of custody record, to a Navy research facility in San Diego in June of 1997. No publication, no press release, and no scientific paper has ever referenced its existence. The political and economic dimensions of the incident moved faster than the investigation and ultimately consumed it. Within hours of the Ras Tanura star's distress signal, the Strait of Hormuz became the most watched waterway on Earth. A fully loaded supertanker disabled in the outbound shipping lane in the narrowest, most strategically sensitive maritime corridor in the world triggered a chain reaction that extended far beyond the vessel itself. The first consequence was navigational. The Ras Tanura star, listing and flooding, had to be stabilized before it could be towed clear of the shipping lane, and for 11 hours, outbound tanker traffic in the strait was reduced to a single lane while salvage operations proceeded. 14 fully loaded crude carriers were delayed. The backlog extended into the Gulf. The second consequence was financial. Lloyd's of London issued a marine risk advisory for the strait within 48 hours, noting unresolved hull damage of indeterminate biological origin and recommending a temporary increase in war risk premiums for all tanker transits. The phrase indeterminate biological origin moved through the London reinsurance market like a virus. Crude oil futures jumped $19 per barrel on the first trading day after the incident, the sharpest single-session increase since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. The premium spike lasted 11 days. During those 11 days, according to a later analysis published in the Journal of Energy Economics, the global cost of the incident in inflated crude prices, increased shipping premiums, and delayed deliveries exceeded $2.4 billion. The pressure to resolve the narrative, to assign a cause that would calm the markets, restore insurance coverage, and keep the tankers moving was not subtle. Coordinated statements from the UAE Maritime Authority, the Sultanate of Oman's Ministry of Transport, and the U.S. Fifth Fleet Public Affairs Office attributed the damage to an uncharted submerged obstruction, a geological explanation that Rayburn's own report had specifically ruled out, and that the NAVSEA acoustic analysis flatly contradicted. The market stabilized. The premiums were quietly withdrawn. The Ras Tanura star was dry docked in Fujairah, repaired at a cost of $14 million, and returned to service within 4 months under the name Horizon Progress. Captain Al-Harthi was not aboard. In the weeks following the incident, Al-Harthi was called before a maritime arbitration panel convened by the vessel's operators to resolve the insurance dispute. His testimony, preserved in the arbitration record, runs to over 6 hours across 2 days. He presented his bridge log, every entry, every timestamp, every sonar reading, with the same precision that had characterized his 22 years of command. He described the contact's behavior in technical nautical terminology, its speed, its depth changes, its circling pattern, its deliberate passes beneath the keel. He testified that in 22 years of transiting the Strait of Hormuz, he had never encountered a marine animal of that size, at that speed, exhibiting that pattern of behavior. He testified that the contact was predatory. He used that word, and the arbitration transcript records a long pause in the room after he said it. He testified that it struck the vessel with what he described as intentional force, not a collision, not an accident, but a directed attack on the hull below the waterline, targeted at the weakest point in the vessel's structural envelope. When asked by the panel how he could characterize the behavior as intentional, Al-Harthi responded with a question of his own, preserved in the transcript. It circled my vessel for 8 hours. It passed beneath my keel. It mapped the hull. And then it struck at the exact point where the engine room meets the ballast void, the point of maximum flooding vulnerability. You tell me what that behavior describes. The arbitration panel noted his testimony. The insurance claim was settled on the structural fatigue finding. Al-Harthi was reassigned to shore duty by his fleet operator, a reassignment that colleagues described as a quiet termination of his seagoing career. He filed a formal objection through the International Maritime Organization's reporting system, citing suppression of evidence and falsification of the official record. The objection was acknowledged by the IMO Secretariat in Geneva. No investigation was opened. Captain Youssef Al-Harthi never commanded a vessel again. He died in 2011 in Muscat, Oman, at the age of 68. His bridge log from the Ras Tanura Star's final transit, the original, handwritten document, was found among his personal effects, stored in a waterproof pouch alongside the two photographs he had taken of the sonar display at 0347 and 0418 on the morning of March 14, 1997. The photographs show a contact return that the sonar was never designed to display, a shape so large that it fills the screen from edge to edge, circling the center point where the Ras Tanura Star sat motionless in the water, waiting for whatever was beneath it to decide what happened next. What no one involved in the arbitration knew, what no one outside a classified compartment at Naval Sea Systems Command knew, was that the acoustic signature, captured on the Ras Tanura Star's bridge recorder, had been heard before. Not in a different ocean, not by a different navy, in the same water, in the same strait, 10 years earlier. A NAVSEA analyst, cross-referencing the 1997 audio with the command's database of classified acoustic files, flagged the match within 72 hours of receiving the bridge recording. The 1987 file was stored under a Department of Defense Special Access Program designation, a classification level that restricts access to personnel specifically read into the program, bypassing even standard top-secret clearance. Its contents described a sonar contact engaged by a U.S. Navy warship during Operation Earnest Will, the escort campaign that protected Kuwaiti oil tankers through the strait during the Iran-Iraq tanker war. The contact had been engaged with depth charges. It had survived. The file had been sealed for a decade, buried beneath 10 years of routine Gulf operations, accessible only to the handful of analysts who maintained the Special Access Program's acoustic library. And the analyst who found it realized, as he compared the two acoustic signatures on his screen, one from a tanker's bridge microphone in 1997, one from a warship's hull-mounted sonar array in 1987, that they were not merely similar. They were identical, the same frequency, the same duration, the same harmonic structure, the same infrasonic pulse that no marine biologist had ever been able to classify, the same animal, still in the strait, still hunting. And the Navy had known since November of 1987, that something was living in the deep water channel of the most important oil transit corridor on Earth. They had fired on it. They had failed to kill it. And they had kept the tankers coming. The acoustic signature that the NAVSEA analyst matched in 1997, the low-frequency infrasonic pulse captured on the Ras Tanura Star's bridge recorder, had been sitting in a classified database for 10 years, filed under a Special Access Program designation that fewer than 40 people in the U.S. Navy had clearance to read. The file was created on November 19, 1987. Its source was the hull-mounted SQS-56 sonar array aboard the guided missile frigate USS Elrod, FFG-55, operating in the central Strait of Hormuz as part of Operation Earnest Will, the U.S. Navy's escort campaign protecting Kuwaiti oil tankers from Iranian attack during the final years of the Iran-Iraq War. What the file contains, and what would remain locked behind a classification wall until a partial declassification in 2012 released fragments of the technical analysis, is a 14-minute sonar recording of a contact that the Navy's own oceanographic experts have never been able to identify. A contact that a U.S. warship engaged with depth charges. A contact that survived. And a contact whose acoustic signature, captured at a range of less than 300 meters by a military-grade passive sonar array, is identical frequency, duration, harmonic structure to the sound recorded on a commercial tanker's bridge microphone a decade later, 3 nautical miles from the same coordinates. To understand what happened aboard the Elrod, you have to understand the war it was fighting and the specific suffocating conditions under which the men aboard that frigate were operating on the night of November 18, 1987. By that November, the Iran-Iraq War had been grinding through its 7th year, and the Persian Gulf had become the most dangerous body of water on Earth for commercial shipping. Both Iran and Iraq were attacking oil tankers, Iraq with air-launched Exocet missiles targeting Iranian oil exports, Iran retaliating against Gulf Arab states by mining shipping lanes and launching small boat swarms, and silkworm anti-ship missiles from coastal batteries on the islands and headlands along the strait. In the 12 months preceding the Elrod engagement, over 150 commercial vessels had been attacked in the Gulf, struck by missiles, holed by mines, or raked by machine gun fire from Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats. The economic stakes were existential. A sustained closure of the strait would have cut off not only Kuwaiti and Saudi exports, but Iraqi oil revenues, the fuel for both sides of the war, and triggered a global energy crisis that the Reagan administration was determined to prevent. The United States, drawn into the conflict by the need to keep Gulf oil flowing to Western and Asian markets, launched Operation Earnest Will in July 1987, a naval escort mission that placed U.S. warships alongside reflagged Kuwaiti tankers, daring Iran to fire on an American vessel and risk direct military confrontation with the world's largest navy. The mission was as much psychological as tactical. The presence of American frigates and destroyers in the strait was intended to deter Iranian aggression through the promise of overwhelming retaliation. But the narrow, shallow, acoustically chaotic waters of the strait negated many of the technological advantages that made the U.S. Navy dominant in open ocean warfare. The water was shallow, 60 to 90 meters across the navigable channel, which compressed the acoustic environment and limited sonar range. The traffic was dense. Dozens of tankers, cargo vessels, fishing boats, and military craft from half a dozen navies operating simultaneously in corridors barely 2 miles wide. The acoustic environment was saturated with engine noise, propeller cavitation, and the biological sounds of a warm, nutrient-rich waterway teeming with marine life. For the sonar operators aboard the escort frigates, the strait was a nightmare of false contacts, overlapping returns, and background noise that made submarine detection their primary mission. And our primary mission, exercise in sustained concentration and the ability to distinguish meaningful patterns from chaos. Lieutenant Commander James Royce had commanded the Elrod for 14 months by November 1987. He was 38 years old, a career surface warfare officer on his 3rd Gulf deployment, and he had developed a reputation within the escort force for measured decision-making, the kind of captain who verified his data twice before acting, who trusted his sonar operators, and who filed after-action reports so thorough that his division commander once remarked that reading a Royce report was like reading a legal brief. This reputation would matter, because when the Navy attempted to dismiss what happened on the night of November 18th as a misidentified whale or a sonar anomaly, it was Royce's own meticulous documentation that made the dismissal impossible to sustain within the classified record. The Elrod was running nighttime escort for a 3-tanker convoy transiting south through the strait, bound for the Gulf of Oman and open water. The convoy consisted of 2 reflagged Kuwaiti VLCCs and a Liberian-registered chemical carrier, spaced at 2 nautical mile intervals, with the Elrod positioned on the eastern flank, the Iranian side, screening for submarine and small boat threats. It was 2214 local time. The sea was calm, the sky moonless, the humidity so thick it blurred the navigation lights of the trailing tankers into soft halos of amber and white. The only illumination came from the running lights of the convoy and the distant, diffused glow of the Iranian coast to the northeast, a coastline that, in November of 1987, was home to Revolutionary Guard missile batteries, radar installations, and the small boat bases from which Iranian speedboat swarms launched their attacks on tanker traffic. Every bridge watch in the strait was a sustained exercise in threat assessment. Every radar contact, every sonar return, every unexplained light on the water was a potential attack vector. The men aboard the Elrod had been living in this state of heightened readiness for months. Sonar technician second class Kevin Hawley was on watch in the Elrod's sonar control room, a dim, blue-lit space dominated by the cascading waterfall display of the SQS-56 sonar system. Hawley had been a sonar operator for 6 years and had spent the better part of 4 months listening to the acoustic chaos of the strait, tanker screws, fishing boat diesels, biological noise from snapping shrimp and whale song, and the occasional submarine contact that sent the ship to general quarters. He knew what the strait sounded like. At 2214, something new appeared on his display. In his sealed deposition, given to Naval Investigative Service 48 hours later, Hyle describes the initial detection in precise technical language. Passive contact, bearing 190, estimated range 2,200 yards. Broadband noise consistent with large biological, initially classified whale. Speed estimate from bearing rate, 14 knots, steady. Depth from convergence zone analysis, approximately 230 feet. What made Hawley flag the contact rather than log it as marine life was the speed. 14 knots sustained in a straight line with no variation. Whales in the strait, humpbacks, bride's whales, the occasional sperm whale, moved at 4 to 8 knots, with constant speed changes reflecting feeding behavior or course adjustments. This contact was driving. Hawley reported to the officer of the deck, who notified Royce. Royce, already on the bridge monitoring the convoy's passage, ordered the contact tracked on passive sonar and directed the sonar team to attempt classification. Over the next 6 minutes, the contact closed from 2,200 yards to 1,400 yards, maintaining its bearing on the convoy's track. Its speed increased to 18 knots. Hale's deposition describes this phase with a single observation that the NIS interviewer underlined. The contact was not traveling in the direction of the convoy. It was traveling toward the convoy. The bearing rate indicated intercept course. At 2,222, Royce ordered the Elrod to general quarters. In the context of Operation Earnest Will, an unidentified submerged contact on an intercept course with a tanker convoy was presumed hostile. Until proven otherwise, the standing rules of engagement were explicit on this point, drafted in the wake of the USS Stark attack 5 months earlier, when an Iraqi Exocet missile had killed 37 American sailors. The Elrod's crew went to battle stations in under 3 minutes. Royce had the sonar team shift to active pinging, transmitting pulses from the SQS-56 to get a hard range, bearing, and depth on the contact. The active return confirmed what passive had suggested and added a dimension that changed everything. The contact was large. The active sonar return indicated an object approximately 60 feet in length, a measurement derived from the time differential between the leading and trailing edges of the return echo, a standard method for estimating target size. That measurement would be disputed in later analysis. Active sonar returns on biological targets are notoriously unreliable due to the acoustic properties of living tissue versus metal, and the strait's complex acoustic environment introduces significant multipath error. But even the most conservative estimate, applying maximum correction for environmental distortion, placed the contact at no less than 45 feet. No submarine in the Iranian inventory was smaller than 175 feet. The smallest Iranian naval vessel capable of submerged operation, the Soviet-supplied Kilo-class diesel-electric boat, had a hull length of 238 feet and produced a distinctive propulsion signature that the Eelrad's sonar team could identify in their sleep. This contact sounded nothing like a kilo. It sounded nothing like any submarine. At the other end of the identification spectrum, no whale species known to inhabit the Gulf of Oman exceeded 50 feet, and no whale behaved like this. The contact occupied a size range that fit nothing in the Eelrad's threat library and nothing in its marine life catalog. It was too small to be a submarine, too large and too fast to be any known biological, and it was headed directly for a convoy of tankers carrying $400 million worth of crude oil through a war zone. And it was accelerating. At 2,226, the contact increased speed to 22 knots and began maneuvering, changing depth rapidly, descending from 230 feet to 280 feet, and back in what Hale's deposition describes as vertical excursions that no submarine I have ever tracked could execute at that speed. A Kilo-class boat changing depth at 22 knots would be tearing itself apart from the pressure differentials. The contact's behavior, as documented in the sonar log and confirmed by Hale's testimony, did not match any tactical pattern in the Navy's submarine warfare manual. It was not running. Its course kept returning to the convoy's track. It was not evading. It made no attempt to use the acoustic clutter of the tanker traffic to mask its signature. It was not attacking. No torpedo launch, no mine deployment, no weapons acoustics of any kind. It was, in Hale's assessment, investigating, circling the convoy the way a predator circles prey, testing distances, measuring reactions, probing for weakness. At 2,228, the contact altered course directly toward the Eelrad. Bearing rate increased sharply. Range close to 800 yards in under 90 seconds. At 2,229, the contact passed directly beneath the Eelrad's hull. Hale's deposition describes the moment. The contact transited directly under the keel at an estimated depth of 200 feet, bearing rate flipping from left to right as it crossed our center line. The acoustic return during the underpass was the loudest biological signature I have ever recorded on passive sonar. The hull vibrated. I could feel it through the deck plates in the sonar shack. It was like standing on a bridge when a freight train passes underneath. The underpass lasted approximately 8 seconds. When the contact emerged on the Eelrad's port side, it slowed, reversed bearing, and began circling the frigate itself, no longer tracking the convoy, but orbiting the warship at a range of 400 to 600 yards. Royce made the decision to engage. His after-action report, written in the methodical prose that characterized all his official documents, describes the decision in a single paragraph. The contact was unidentified, large, submerged, on an intercept course, maneuvering aggressively, and operating within weapons range of a convoy he was tasked to protect. The rules of engagement authorized weapons free. At 2,231, the Eelrad's weapons officer deployed 2 Mark 9 depth charges from the stern rails, set for detonation at 250 feet. The Mk-9 was a 200-pound TNT charge designed to destroy submarines through the concussive force of underwater. Detonation: the pressure wave alone could rupture a submarine hull at ranges up to 50 yards. The 2 charges detonated at 2,231 to 40 and 2,231 to 44. Detonations produced standard blast signatures on the sonar display, the familiar expanding ring of acoustic energy that, in a successful submarine engagement, would be followed by secondary sounds: hull collapse, flooding, air escaping from a broken pressure vessel, the groan of steel folding in on itself. None of those sounds came. No debris field rose to the surface. No oil slick appeared in the searchlight beam. No air bubbles broke the calm water astern. The depth charges had detonated within what the sonar data indicated was 100 yards of the contact. In Hale's words, direct acoustic path, optimal detonation geometry. If that was a Kilo-class submarine, it would have been dead. For 12 seconds after the second detonation, the sonar display showed nothing but the residual noise of the blast dissipating through the water column. Then the contact reappeared. Hale's deposition describes the moment with a precision that suggests he has replayed it in his mind many times. At approximately 2,232 hours, I reacquired the contact on passive. Same bearing. It hadn't moved laterally. Same depth, approximately 250 feet, but the acoustic character had changed. Before the engagement, the contact's primary emission was low-frequency broadband, engine noise, biologics, something moving through the water. After the detonation, it was producing a new sound. A pulse, infrasonic fundamental, but with a harmonic in the 40 to 60 hertz range that was clearly audible through the headset. Rhythmic, sustained. I logged it as a biological vocalization because it didn't match any mechanical source in the database. But I have to be honest with you. I don't know what it was. It sounded like something in pain. It sounded like something angry. It sounded like something screaming. That sound, the infrasonic pulse with its audible harmonic, lasted for 93 seconds. The NAVSEA technical memorandum that would later analyze the recording describes it as a sustained, amplitude-modulated infrasonic emission with a fundamental frequency of approximately 12 hertz, producing audible harmonics at 48 and 60 hertz. The emission does not correspond to any vessel, weapon system, or cataloged marine species in the Naval Oceanographic Office database. The memorandum adds, in a footnote, that the 2012 partial declassification left unredacted. The acoustic structure of the emission is consistent with a biological vocalization produced by a very large organism. No known living species is capable of producing a sustained emission at this frequency and amplitude. After 93 seconds, the pulse stopped, and the contact moved. Royce's after-action report documents what happened next with the controlled language of a man who understood that what he was writing would either be believed or would end his career. At 2,234 hours, the contact accelerated from a stationary position to an estimated speed of 30-plus knots on a bearing of 170, south-southeast, toward the Gulf of Oman. The contact maintained this speed for approximately 2 minutes before passing beyond the effective detection range of the SQS-5-6 array. At no point during the acceleration phase did the contact exhibit the acoustic characteristics of a submarine propulsion system. The acceleration profile is inconsistent with any known vessel type, 30 knots from a standing start. In under 10 seconds, after absorbing 2 depth charges at close range, no submarine in any Navy's inventory, not in 1987, not today, can accelerate from 0 to 30 knots in 10 seconds. No whale can sustain 30 knots for 2 minutes. The contact exited the strait to the south and disappeared into the deep water of the Gulf of Oman. The convoy completed its transit without further incident. Naval Investigative Service personnel arrived aboard the Ilrod at Bahrain the following afternoon, faster than standard procedure, which suggested to Royce that someone in the chain of command had already reviewed the preliminary sonar data and understood that the engagement did not fit standard categories. They collected the sonar recordings, the weapons expenditure logs, the bridge voice recorder tapes, and the handwritten notes of every watchstander who had been on duty during the engagement. They also collected, over Royce's objection, the personal notes he had made in his stateroom immediately after the event, a 4-page longhand account that he had written, while the details were fresh, intending to use it as the basis for his formal after-action report. Those personal notes have never been declassified. They took sealed depositions from Hull A, from the weapons officer, from the officer of the deck, from the lookouts posted on the bridge wings, and from Royce himself. each deposition conducted separately, each witness instructed not to discuss his testimony with the others. The NES team also interviewed the Eelrod's chief engineer, who reported that the ship's hull-mounted transducer, the device that transmitted the active sonar pings, had recorded an anomalous return during the contact's underpass that suggested the object's skin or outer surface had an acoustic impedance significantly different from water, marine mammal tissue, or submarine steel. The chief engineer described the return as dense, more like rock than flesh. Royce's deposition, portions of which were released in the 2012 partial declassification, runs to 4 hours. He describes the contact's behavior in methodical detail, its initial approach, its intercept geometry, its aggressive maneuvering, its survival of the depth charges, its acoustic emission, its departure speed. When the NI's interviewer asked Royce to classify the contact, he declined to speculate on the record. When pressed, he offered a single observation. "I have tracked submarines from 5 different navies. I have tracked whales, dolphins, and large pelagic fish. This contact behaved like none of them. Its speed, its maneuverability, its size, and its survival of 2 Mk9 detonations at close range are inconsistent with any threat or biological entity in my experience. I am unable to classify it. I recommend the recording be analyzed by NAVSEA and by the Naval Oceanographic Office. Both analyses were conducted. Both reached the same conclusion: unidentifiable. The Naval Oceanographic Office ran the acoustic emission against every biological recording in their marine mammal database, over 12,000 cataloged vocalizations from 47 species. No match. They ran it against industrial and geological sound libraries, submarine machinery, offshore drilling, seismic activity, volcanic venting. No match. They consulted with marine biologists at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, providing the recording without context, without identifying the source, the location, or the circumstances of its capture. The Scripps team's response, preserved in the declassified correspondence, described the recording as almost certainly biological in origin, produced by an organism of significant mass, and unlike any vocalization in the published marine acoustic literature. They asked where the recording had been made. The Navy declined to answer. The NAVSEA memorandum, drawing on both the Oceanographic Office analysis and the Scripps consultation, recommended that the file be transferred to a special access program, a classification level that would effectively remove it from the Navy's standard intelligence databases and restrict access to a handful of analysts with specific program clearance. The recommendation was approved within a week. The file was sealed. The acoustic recording of something screaming in the deep channel of the Strait of Hormuz was filed alongside the most sensitive intelligence, material the United States Navy possessed, the kind of material that shared classification space with nuclear weapons targeting data and submarine detection algorithms. The reason for this extreme classification has never been officially stated, but the logic is not difficult to reconstruct. If the recording represented a biological entity of unknown species of enormous size, capable of surviving military ordnance, inhabiting the most economically critical maritime corridor on Earth, then the implications were not scientific. They were strategic. A confirmed biological threat in the Strait of Hormuz would trigger exactly the kind of insurance crisis, shipping disruption, and oil market panic that no government with an interest in Gulf stability could afford. The information was not classified because it was unimportant. It was classified because it was too important. Royce requested permission to file a supplemental report characterizing the contact as biological in origin, based on its acoustic emission profile and its behavior during and after the depth charge engagement. The request was denied by his division commander, who, according to a handwritten note in the declassified file, cited operational security concerns and the absence of conclusive species identification as the basis for the denial. The official after-action report attributes the depth charge expenditure to a probable Iranian submarine contact. Not confirmed, a classification that satisfied the convoy escort mission's accountability requirements while erasing the anomalous details from the operational record. 200 pounds of TNT fired at a living animal in a shipping lane, and the paperwork calls it a submarine that got away. Royce was not disciplined. He was not reassigned. He completed his command tour aboard the Elrod, received a standard fitness report, and rotated back to shore duty at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where he spent the next 3 years teaching tactical decision-making to junior officers. But colleagues who served with him in subsequent years have noted that he never discussed the November 18th engagement in professional settings, never used it as a tactical teaching case, never referenced it in the wargaming exercises he supervised, never mentioned it in the unclassified memoir he began drafting in his final years. This was unusual for a man who had participated in one of the only live weapons engagements of Operation Earnest Will, an event that, under normal circumstances, would have been a career-defining professional credential. Royce's silence extended to his personal life. His wife, interviewed by a defense journalist researching a book on the tanker war in 2014, said that he mentioned the engagement exactly once on the night he returned from that deployment, and then never spoke of it again. She said she found that strange because he talked about everything else that happened during his Gulf tours: the mine strikes, the Iranian small boat encounters, the tension of the convoy escorts, but not that night, not the depth charges, not what was on the sonar. The only reference to the event in his personal papers is the letter to his wife, written on November 21, 1987, 3 days after the engagement, and never sent. The letter was found in a sealed envelope in his desk at their home in Annapolis after he died of pancreatic cancer in 2009. It reads, in part, "I engaged something tonight that was alive and large, beyond anything I was trained to fight. I put 2 depth charges on it at close range, and it shook them off and left at a speed that nothing in the water can match. I have not told anyone what I believe it was, because I do not fully believe it myself. But I saw the sonar. I heard the sound it made, and I think it has been in these waters for a very long time." Royce never sent the letter. He never filed the supplemental report. And the acoustic recording, the 93 seconds of infrasonic screaming that represented the only direct evidence of what the Elrod had engaged, remained locked in a special access program database, accessible to no one who was not specifically read into the program. For 10 years, it sat there, while the tankers kept transiting, while 20% of the world's oil supply continued to flow through a strait that the U.S. Navy knew from its own sonar data, its own weapons engagement, its own analysts' classification of very large organism, harbored something that could shrug off depth charges and outrun a destroyer. The Deep Water Advisory that the Naval Oceanographic Office added to the Strait of Hormuz in early 1988, a routine-looking notation on navigational charts recommending that vessels exercise caution regarding uncharted deep water biological hazards, was the only visible trace of the Elrod engagement in any unclassified document. No one in the commercial shipping industry asked what it meant. No one at Lloyd's of London flagged it as relevant to insurance risk assessments. No one at the UAE Maritime Authority or the International Maritime Organization questioned why the U.S. Navy had quietly added a biological hazard warning to the most heavily trafficked shipping lane on the planet. The advisory was still active on the morning of March 14, 1997, when Captain Youssef Al-Harthi began logging sonar contacts that circled his vessel for 8 hours before something tore a crescent-shaped hole in its hull. The Navsia analyst who matched the 2 acoustic signatures, the Elrod's 1987 sonar recording, and the Ras Tanura Star's 1997 bridge audio, submitted his findings through the Special Access Programs, our EPOR-TING channel, in April of 1997. His analysis confirmed that the 2 recordings captured the same infrasonic emission from the same biological source, recorded 10 years apart in the same body of water, within 3 nautical miles of the same coordinates, the same animal, the same hunting ground, the same strait that carries 20% of the world's oil. The analyst's report recommended 3 actions. First, that the 1987 and 1997 files be consolidated under a single program designation. Second, that the Naval Oceanographic Office upgrade the Deep Water Advisory to a formal hazard warning with specific guidance for commercial traffic. And third, that the consolidated file be shared with NOAA and the Smithsonian Institution for biological assessment. The first recommendation was approved. The second and third were denied. The tankers kept coming. The oil kept flowing. And somewhere in the deep channel of the Strait of Hormuz, in the warm, saline, ancient water that marine biologists have compared to a Miocene ocean, something that survived 200 pounds of TNT at close range continued to patrol its territory, circling beneath the hulls of the largest vessels ever built, occasionally rising to the surface to leave a wake that no one on the bridge could explain, occasionally descending to sit on the bottom and wait. It had been there in 1987 when a Navy frigate tried to kill it and failed. It was there in 1997 when it opened a supertanker like a tin can and triggered the largest single-event oil price spike in 7 years. And the evidence, the sonar recordings, the acoustic analyses, the sealed depositions, the tooth fragment that the Smithsonian identified as belonging to a species 3.5 million years extinct, suggests that it is there still. The Strait of Hormuz remains the most critical maritime choke point on Earth. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply still passes through it every day. The Deep Water Advisory remains active. No explanation for it has ever been published. If you've spent time on the water, if you've worked the Gulf, transited the Strait, or served on a vessel in those waters, and you've seen something you couldn't explain, we want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. And subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.